So thanks everyone for joining. Indy VMUG is near and dear to my heart. I'm a part of this community too. Probably not as much as I should be, or I used to be, but always love talking to this group. I see a lot of familiar names. I see a lot of new ones that I don't know. Hopefully, when this whole situation, this pandemic situation clears, we'll all meet face to face at a VMUG sometime soon. But today, I want to get, Bob and I are going to talk about vSphere 7, right? This is a super important release for us. It's a big release, which you'll probably hear me drone on and on about. Some of the folks in marketing say it's the biggest release in a decade. And honestly, it may be even bigger than that. There's a lot of paradigm shifts in terms of how we're dealing with things like Kubernetes, but there are also, for folks that don't even care how to spell Kubernetes, there's plenty of stuff in the core of vSphere that's new and interesting, and that'll continue to help push the envelope of virtualization and hybrid cloud. So with that, here's kind of the, if I can get my clicker to, there we go. Here's kind of the agenda. We'll talk a little bit about sort of high-level messaging, just to kind of set the stage, right? This is VMUG, right? You guys don't want to hear marketing stuff, architecture and all that kind of stuff. So we're not going to spend too much time, but there is a stage that needs to be set. What's the bigger context? Why are we doing what we're doing? So we'll just spend a tiny bit of time on that. And then we'll kind of go into some of the areas. I'll talk a little bit about Kubernetes, but like I said, I'm not going to spend a significant amount of time talking about that. That's really a topic in and of itself, but I do want to kind of share a little bit about where we're going, why we're going there, what problems we're trying to solve. And then, there's a lot of stuff in vSphere lifecycle, and then I'll hand it off to Bob for kind of the second part to talk about security, his bread and butter, and application acceleration. So as I mentioned, this is really a huge release, right? We've got vSphere with Kubernetes, which brings together containers and virtual machines, right? It's not that we're just bolting on Kubernetes to vSphere, right? We're changing the ESXi hypervisor at a kernel level to be able to accommodate and manage these new object types, right? So there's a couple of different ways to work with Kubernetes and vSphere, and I'll kind of highlight that. But again, I'm not going to go into an immense level of detail. But for everything else, right, as I mentioned, the core still has a lot of stuff. And it looks like my animation is broken, so apologies for that. But we've got improved DRS. We took something that is pretty mature, and we, made an order of magnitude level improvement on it. DRS has up to now has been really about, the cluster as a whole, right? Is the cluster balanced? Are the resources being utilized effectively within the cluster? But what we really needed to do, and what customers really needed, is that we needed to look at the virtual machines and the applications themselves, right? So if we look at virtual machines and we make decisions on how to move those virtual machines around, that leads to better resource utilization, not only for the cluster, but for the VMs themselves. So I'll talk a little bit more. Actually, Bob will talk a little bit more about that. And then something that helps assignable, or helps DRS, is assignable hardware. It's really a framework that provides visibility into what hardware is exposed to a virtual machine. So think specialized stuff like GPUs, FPGAs, ASICs, those types of things. So DRS and vSphere HA didn't really have visibility into that type of hardware before. Now with assignable hardware, we're providing a framework so those features can figure out and make decisions whether we're restarting a VM during an HA event, or we're just simply trying to move a VM over to an underutilized host. Assignable hardware enables DRS and HA to make some of those decisions where they haven't been in the past. And then Lifecycle Manager. And I don't know about you guys, but this animation is really throwing me. I need to fix this. So we've got a lot of stuff with Lifecycle. First and foremost is Lifecycle Manager. We're really taking the way that we manage lifecycle within a vSphere environment and moving to a desired state model. If you think about how tools like Puppet how they manage environments. You take some sort of text file, could be YAML or JSON or whatever, and you define some sort of state that you want your infrastructure to be in. And a tool like Puppet deploys it and then constantly manages it to make sure that it stays within that desired state. We're doing similar things in vSphere with Lifecycle Manager. There's a few different components of Lifecycle Manager we'll get into, some that deal with vCenter, some that deal with ESXi, and we'll talk about how it all comes together. But we're kind of moving away from the set and forget types of infrastructure. We want to define what our infrastructure needs to be. Infrastructure is code per se. At least that's where we're marching towards. And then we're going to consistently manage and monitor that infrastructure and make sure it stays in the state that we want. And then vMotion. vMotion, like DRS, is another technology that's been around for a while, right? But we broke it down again and refactored it. One of the challenges that we were trying to solve in this release with vMotion is there's lots of bigger applications, there's lots of resource-intensive applications that they struggled under vMotion conditions, right? We've got a stun time that could possibly be longer than the application could sustain. We tried to target 1 second or less, right? We kind of the age-old thing where when you vMotion, you've got a ping going in another window in a command prompt somewhere, and you vMotion an application, you say, oh, I lost a ping, or sometimes you don't even lose a ping, and that application landed on the other server. When you have an SAP HANA machine, or an Oracle database, or something that's really IO intensive, that stun time where we stop IO to the VM and replicate it over to the other host, when there's lots of IO going on, it takes a long time to replicate that memory over to the other host. And so that could cause the application to think that it's failed because, hey, I've lost communication with one of my components. It's not responding for a second or 2 or 5, whatever it takes. And then there's some sort of failure. So what we did with vMotion was we broke it down, as I mentioned, and we changed a whole bunch of stuff under the covers to enable even the largest VMs, even the most IO-intensive VMs, to have smaller stun times and be able to vMotion effectively so that they don't think that there's a failure. And Bob will talk more about that. And then last, intrinsic security. Things like identity federation is, I think, going to be big for customers. Customers continuously ask us for how do we extend vCenter to work with X multi-factor authentication. And the reality is that there's just a huge ecosystem there, and it was challenging to be able to extend vCenter to every solution in the marketplace. So we took a little bit different approach that Bob will get into with identity federation, which I think is really cool. So stay tuned for that. And then there's a number of other improvements around certificates, trust authority, and so I think you'll be interested in all those things. So that's kind of the high level. Let's kind of dig into each of these different areas and talk. So when we look at the landscape, right, the world is not just about virtual machines anymore. Containers have been around. You'll get some purists that are like, well, containers, sort of predate, x86, right? We were running containers on mainframe. And while that's true, and containers have been around for a long time, we're really seeing a proliferation within, I'd say, the last decade, but, really more recently than that, within the last 3-4 years. And then there's all kinds of container orchestration, right? So you have to have ways to manage the infrastructure and manage the containers themselves. And that's where Kubernetes comes in. There's lots of different solutions, but Kubernetes has sort of risen to the top, so to speak, and seems to be the one orchestration engine that lots of support has coalesced around. So that's kind of where we're focused at VMware. So when we look at virtual machines and the vSphere admin, right? And we look at developers and DevOps and folks who are writing code and applications. They use completely different tool sets. Their goals are really different. But we want to bring them together on a common set of infrastructure, right? Applications today are not just your simple three-tiered application anymore, where you've got some sort of web front-end virtual machine, you've got some sort of application layer virtual machine, and you've got a database back-end, right? Applications are much more complex. We've got microservices, we've got you know, one application can be made up of dozens of containers that, you know, are these microservices, and then we've got Kubernetes and or whatever orchestration engine that might be involved, managing the life cycle of these containers, doing things like, you know, if we need a load balancer or high availability for resiliency, you know, all those things are being managed by an orchestration engine, and in this case, you know, it's Kubernetes. So, as I mentioned, the vSphere admin and, you know, the engineers are really doing these things sometimes on completely different infrastructure, right? The DevOps guys and gals can go swipe a credit card and go deploy Kubernetes or, you know, containers in general in Amazon Web Services, right? Or some other cloud provider. And then we've got our vSphere admins that are saying, hey, why are you guys developing your application over in this other infrastructure that we don't manage? None of our corporate policies around security and availability apply to those things, because, you know, our controls don't apply or don't have a way of being applied. You know, how do we handle that? You know, it's kind of the age-old discussion around shadow IT, right? You want to have you want your IT organization to have the ability to provide a service to your application developers that they can consume, use all the tools that they want to use. You know, they want a Kubernetes-based API to develop and deploy their applications. So let's give that to them. So the idea, right, is that we've got all these different things running around. We need to provide one consistent platform that all of these people can use and manage and love. And so we feel that we've done that with vSphere with Kubernetes. So it's all built on VMware Cloud Foundation, right? If you haven't deployed Kubernetes before or looked at deploying Kubernetes before, let me clue you in on something, that it is complex. There are lots of different components to Kubernetes. And, you know, again, just to be more general, to container orchestration in general, right? Containers are different than VMs in a lot of respects. And so they need different ways to manage. And we really feel the best way to manage and to bring all of these things together in that consistent infrastructure is through Cloud Foundation. Not only is Kubernetes complex, but, you know, also the underlying networking is complex. Cloud Foundation is able to automate all of those things. You need to deploy NSX. Cloud Foundation has a great way to deploy and manage NSX. If you're doing all of these things on your own, piecemeal, individually, it's really not the best recipe for success. So by building all of this stuff on top of Cloud Foundation, we're giving everybody the best recipe for success. We're giving everybody a common platform, regardless if you're working on premises or if you're working with a cloud provider or a combination thereof. Cloud Foundation is that consistent platform across, with storage and networking and, you know, of course, vSphere, as well as, you know, lifecycle automation, monitoring, all those things, all common components to this. So this is really the story of how we're bringing all these different pieces together for consistency and operational simplicity. So there's a few different pieces to this. I mentioned that there's a few different ways to actually deploy Kubernetes. One of those ways is with our Tanzu portfolio. And in fact, if you're going to deploy Kubernetes within your virtual environment, it's probably going to be with Tanzu Kubernetes Grid Service. TKG is our fully conformant Kubernetes platform. So basically, this is upstream Kubernetes. It's deployed in virtual machines on top of vSphere, but it is, if you've got developers using Kubernetes today, this is probably what they will want because it's the exact same Kubernetes they're already using. It's all built into and managed by Cloud Foundation. So your vSphere admins, you can manage the infrastructure for your DevOps folks, right? You provide you provide an API endpoint to them, and they continue doing what they need to do. And by the way, when they need help, it's easy to translate whatever they're working on into constructs that vSphere admins can understand and interact with. We do all that translation for you. So, you go into the vSphere client and a developer is having issues with their API endpoint or something within their namespace. We have visibility into all of those things, and we can say, oh, well, here somebody stripped your permissions, or hey, this pod is powered off for some reason. Let's go troubleshoot that. So it's really a way that you can provide your developers the service that they want and also provide them the support they need, while also having all of this within your corporate policy structure. So all of your controls can be applied here. And so kind of it's a win-win scenario, right? There's no more shadow IT in this model. I mentioned namespaces. Namespaces are a new construct within vSphere, not new to Kubernetes, but new within vSphere. And namespaces are cool in the Kubernetes construct, or Kubernetes context, I should say, because they give vSphere admins a way to create a set of resources that they can then hand off to a developer or whoever is going to consume them, right? These namespaces, we can apply permissions policies. They're backed by resource pools. If I'm not mistaken, I've got a little animation here. Yep. They're backed by a resource pool. So you define a set of resources and as part of this namespace, and then you can also set things like storage policies, right, with SPBM, to make sure that, hey, this namespace is for development, and so it's only going to use this class of storage and these data stores, so the developer can go crazy and do whatever, and it's not going to impact production, right? And you've got another namespace that's, hey, this is a production application, only these people have access to make changes, and it's only going to use this tier 1 and tier 0 storage, and it's going to be best performing there. So namespaces, I like to think of them as sort of like vApps that actually work and do valuable things. I'm obviously not a fan of vApps, but namespaces are really just a way to take a set of resources, apply some policies around it, and let folks kind of work within that sandbox and consume those resources. So as I mentioned, in the Kubernetes context, this is pretty cool. But think about if you don't care about Kubernetes, namespaces are actually a really cool construct for just VMs. And so in the future, when we support virtual machines within namespaces, this will be a really cool new way to manage infrastructure. We get a lot of questions about, hey, I've got a junior admin and I only want to let him work within this little bubble in the environment. That can be challenging prior to vSphere 7. But with vSphere 7 and beyond, we'll be able to work with namespaces, and we'll be able to give folks their own bubble and own sandbox. And it's got all of the tooling that we need to do that. It's not sort of put together in a bunch of different ways. And, there's could be ways around it, around permission structures, and maybe they see things they shouldn't be seeing, in the vSphere client. So namespaces is our way to, whether they're a vSphere admin or a developer or maybe a line of business owner, all they want is visibility into, is their application running? Namespaces is a way that can facilitate all of those things and more. So this is going to be really cool. Like I said, even if you don't have any cares whatsoever about Kubernetes, namespaces is something to watch. So to kind of segue into the rest of this, right? That's all I'm going to talk about Kubernetes for now. So hopefully most of you are still with me. This is a mind map that Niels Haggard on our team put together. And I just want to show it because I think it's important just to show that this is a huge release, and it's not all about Kubernetes. Yes, it's important. It's important strategically for VMware and for lots of our customers, but it's not everything. So, there's plenty here. Bob and I will talk about a lot of this, probably not all of it, but we've got plenty of resources that you can follow up with, whether that's on the vSphere blog or other places, and we've got links towards the end. So with that, let's kind of talk, focus on lifecycle. So lifecycle management in vSphere 7, we've kind of broken it down into 3 different areas. One is vCenter server profiles. I talked about desired state configuration. VC profiles are a way to do some of that desired state configuration as it applies to vCenter server itself, right? So we'll talk about that in a minute. And then Lifecycle Manager is a tool that manages lots of different things as it relates to the hosts themselves, the ESXi hosts. We do things more where we're creating that desired state at the cluster level, and then that way when we scale out that cluster later, we replace hosts, we upgrade hosts. All of that lifecycle management is done with VLCM, and no more having to manage individual host profiles and all those kinds of things. So this is, again, a paradigm shift, and I think a really important and good one in how we're going to manage lifecycle going forward. And for those of you that maybe have Dell or HPE infrastructures, or maybe a combination, yes, we do integrate with our hardware OEMs, and I've got a slide on that. Last in this sort of umbrella of lifecycle is Update Planner. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. We know upgrades are hard, all right? We know they're problematic. We know that they're complex and there's a lot of steps, right? So Update Planner was something that, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Ahmad Yunus, but he worked a lot on Update Planner because he knew from working in tech marketing that there were a lot of challenges. And so he wanted to help create a tool that would sort of ease some of that complexity and take away a lot of the questions and how do I upgrade my vSphere environment when I've got SRM or NSX or vSAN or whatever applications dependent on vCenter server. So Update Planner is a way for us to help you take a look at what's in the environment. Like, let's take stock of what's there. What's everything running from a version perspective, and what happens if we want to upgrade? What are the steps involved? What are the impacts going to be to those other products? Do I need to upgrade those other products? Are they compatible with the version that I'm trying to get to? So Update Planner is a way to make all of that simpler and built right into the vSphere client so that we can help you effectively plan and just have confidence that when you actually end up going through the upgrade, that it's tested and you're going to get the desired result, right? We want to eliminate those surprises. Unfortunately, we know that there's some percentage of people out there that do what we used to call go cowboy, and just as soon as a new version goes out, they just upgrade and they deal with whatever problems come up, and they get to the version that they're going to get to through hard work and determination. But this tool is really meant to give you a way to just, hey, let me see if I have a plan. Let me make sure that all these things are good to go. Hit the upgrade button, and you get to that level of whatever version you're trying to get to. So more details on all the stuff coming. So vCenter server profiles, as I mentioned, we use JSON to define or to list out the configuration of our vCenter that we've deployed. And we can also import that configuration to other vCenter servers, right? So it really is a profile and a desired state, right? It's going to be more powerful later on. We're going to continue to build on this functionality, right? But today, this is all done via API. We can list out the configuration. And when I say configuration, I want to be clear that this is not, basically when you go into the VAMI of the vCenter server, right, you're able to configure things like DNS and IP addresses and administrator password expiration and NTP settings and all those things. That is the configuration that we're talking about here. It's not distributed switches. It's not VMs and folders and resource pools and those types of things. Those are all objects that you need to use some sort of backup tool to back up, right? The profile is really, I'm deploying vCenters in the environment. I need them to be configured to all use the same NTP servers, to all have consistent DNS settings, and so on and so forth. So, whether you're a customer and you happen to have, dozens of vCenters, or maybe you have 3, or maybe you have 1. This is a way to export that configuration, have an easily documented configuration for it. So if something changes, you've got something to compare to. Or if you're a partner, if you're doing lots of vCenter deployments, this is a way for you to make sure that you've deployed those vCenters for your customers in a very consistent manner. And then also the validate step is hugely important, right? We want to be able to validate that these profiles or these vCenter configurations are what we want them to be, what we originally deployed them as. So that validation API is hugely important. So that gives us that way to continue to monitor that desired state, right? So there's a KB article out there that has, I believe it's a Python script, if I remember right, on how to work with these APIs. Nigel Hickey on the team is also working on some more content. So make sure you watch the blog in terms of how to work with vCenter profiles even more than what we've kind of gone over today. Next is LCM. So this is cool and interesting, but it's only sort of a first iteration. Lifecycle Manager is going to be, it really is a paradigm shift, right? We are moving away from things like auto deploy and host profiles, things that I would argue haven't been the most reliable in the past. And I think if you're a customer that's used host profiles, I think that you would probably agree. So host profiles and auto deploy are not going away anytime soon. Let's say there's definitely a transition period. It's not like vSphere 7 doesn't have those things, and you have to fully adopt VLCM. Both exist so that you can work out a transition plan. Those are basically the extra VIBs that some of our vendors inject into their ESXi images. So, when you download a Dell ESXi image or the HPE ESXi image, they put some extra stuff in there that can help, their tools, OpenManage or OpenView, get information out of the hardware, right? So those are the vendor add-ons. Just to be clear. And then there's the firmware and driver versions, right? We create a profile that has, a collection of the drivers and firmware for whatever's in the box, right? NIC drivers, HPA drivers, so on and so forth. And then, the bottom pane, which is kind of obscured here, that's the compliance part. That's the other important part. So we've defined the image, what's compliant, so this probably looks a little bit familiar to VUM. And that's because it shares, there's some overlap there, I should say. Again, just like with auto deploy and host profiles, VUM is not completely gone in this release, but we're migrating all of that functionality into a common umbrella, which is Lifecycle Manager, and we'll get there sometime in the not too distant future, I would say. I talked a lot about Update Planner and kind of stole my own thunder. But this, obviously I'm passionate about this. This is important, important functionality, important stuff that customers have been asking for, and just things that we need to do to help customers stay current, right? If I put, I never take my VMware hat off, I guess, but to make sure that my VMware hat is on, we create a lot of value with vSphere. vSphere is an integral part to a lot of infrastructure. And so it's important to us that customers can leverage and take advantage of the cool new things that our engineers are building, right? And we think that, there is a lot there. I realize that the reality is there's customers, some of you on this call may still have hosts that are running vSphere 4 or maybe even older. Somebody's still trying to win the uptime challenge with an ESXi 3 host out there somewhere. And that's fine, right? Sometimes that there's an application that requires that. But we really need to get to a point where customers are able to upgrade their infrastructure on a more frequent basis, right? We want you to get the value that we're building in the product, right? And, that's why with a valid support contract, you are entitled to the upgrade, right? Even if you're running vSphere 6 today, which is out of support, by the way, but even if that's you, and you have an active support contract, you're paying good money to VMware for support, you can download vSphere 7 today, right? It doesn't cost you anything to upgrade your license keys. And so Upgrade Planner is a way for us to ensure that we're getting the value that we're creating into your hands or your customer's hands, whichever the case may be. And so that's why it's important, and that's why I kind of droned on a lot about it. But it is what it sounds like it is. It is a way for us to not only tell you that updates are available, but a way for us to scratch and sniff the environment and tell you that, hey, if you upgrade your environment to vSphere 7 Update 1, whenever something like that might be available, the version of NSX that you're running or the version of SRM that you're running, hey, it's not compatible. You need to also upgrade SRM to whatever version it happens to need. So again, it's really a way for us to make sure that customers can upgrade and want to upgrade, and providing the visibility that they need to do that successfully. Again, just a UI screenshot of what it, these are obviously mock-ups because they show vSphere 6.7. Something that is important to note is Update Planner is something that is not able to be backported because of the intelligence that it's using. That stuff just doesn't exist in older versions of vSphere. So while the screenshot kind of indicates that you could use Update Planner to plan your upgrade from vSphere 6.7 or older to vSphere 7, that's not the case. Update Planner will help you once you get to vSphere 7. So as I mentioned, like when the first patch comes out for vSphere 7 or an update release or even whatever's after vSphere 7, right? Update Planner will help you in those cases. It will not help you plan your upgrade from 6.7 to 7 or 6.5 to 7. So keep that in mind. And if you want more detail on why that is, ping me offline. You can export the pre-update checks. This is nice for, let's say you just get a ton of failures or warnings or whatever, and you need to show your boss, like, hey, these are all the things that I've been telling you about that's going to prevent our successful upgrade. Here's a report. Again, just trying to to give administrators a little bit more quality of life, so that you can continue to do successful upgrades. The interoperability is nice because, again, it's not just about vSphere, right? Very few customers these days are running only vSphere in their environment. There's probably some out there for sure, but I'd say that the vast majority of our customers are running other VMware products on top of vSphere. And so this is a way for us to, let you know what's compatible and what's not. So there, as I've kind of alluded to, there are some considerations with upgrade. One of the things that we've done in this release, and really this shouldn't be news, right? We announced deprecations of things like external PSCs and vCenter Server for Windows, in some cases more than a year ago. But nonetheless, it's important to hear and to see that, while we've had these complicated topologies available to customers for a while, the complexity and the has really overshadowed the value of those topologies. Throwing platform services controllers behind a load balancer. Yes, it made stuff more highly available, but at the end of the day, there's other components to worry about. There's a load balancer that's probably managed by a different team. So if you ever need to make a configuration change or troubleshoot something, you have to involve more people. To upgrade an environment like what's shown on the screen is a pretty big undertaking, right? So while yes, having the vSphere SSO domain be more highly available with the use of external PSCs and load balancers was important for some customers, we really feel that the complexity really outweighed any value that it adds. So with that in mind, this is really what you see in vSphere 7. We've completely removed the ability to deploy external PSCs. It's just not a part of vSphere 7. And vSphere 7 does not have vCenter Server for Windows. So it's all appliance-based, it's all embedded PSC, and really, PSCs should just be treated as another service of vCenter Server, right? We kind of, in some respects, I think we misstepped in having the PSC be treated as a separate entity from vCenter Server. And the reality is, and especially now that we're in this new vSphere 7 topology, PSC, the Platform Services Controller, it should really just be the platform server service, right? It's a single service that runs on vCenter Server. All the complexity of having it stand on its own is gone. And so it's super easy. And if you have an external platform services controller today, let's say you're running vSphere 6.5 with external PSCs. Now the upgrade, the UI that you've used to upgrade vCenter for years now has a built-in converge tool. It's not separate steps anymore. You don't have to converge before you upgrade or converge after you upgrade. We will detect that, hey, there's an external platform services controller and it's been deprecated. And if you click learn more, you'll go to a KB article, right? That tells you more about it in case you weren't aware. But you are now, right? And so we're taking you from that external PSC and we're embedding it all in upgrading, all in one step. So no separate tools, no separate process, it's all built in. If you're running vCenter Server for Windows, same deal. And this has been the way for the last few versions anyway, but we can converge, upgrade, and migrate from Windows all in a single UI, all in a single step. So that makes it super easy. Again, we used to have separate tools that added some complexity. Now we're roping all those in together, and it's one seamless process. A couple of things that I want to point out, and this should all be published now that vSphere 7 is GA. So you can go to configmax.vmware.com. One of the things that I want to point out is really, if you're running linked mode or enhanced linked mode, there's a big jump in amount of infrastructure you can manage. So, we increase 3x from the amount of hosts and the amount of virtual machines that you can manage in a vSphere SSO domain. So that's big. You know, there's only a certain number of customers that are going to get excited about this because, you know, there's only so many customers that are that large. But I think it's a testament to the amount of engineering work that's been put into this to make sure that whatever the scale that you're working with, vCenter is going to perform not only adequately but great, right? So we are working on, you know, there's a little bit of a increase in what latencies we can tolerate from a vCenter perspective. Prior to vSphere 7, well, really prior to vSphere 6, 7, some of these latency figures weren't really even documented. So it was hard to say what was supported versus what was not. With vSphere 6, 7, and now with vSphere 7, we're doing much more testing. We're doing much more investment in these areas because we really want customers to be able to do things like have global SSO domains if you think that is appropriate for your infrastructure. You know, we aren't really at that point today with these latency numbers. You know, 150 milliseconds round trip. That's maybe from East Coast to London, or, you know, East Coast to West Coast. You know, other geographies. If you've got data centers in other continents, you know, maybe that's doable. But we're not at a point yet where we can have a data center in New York connecting to a data center in Singapore or Japan or something, because that latency is well over 150 milliseconds if my memory serves. So still use caution when you're designing your environments. The good news is even if you're like, oh crap, I didn't know this now, you know, and you're like, how am I going to tell my boss that we're not in a supported configuration because we've got all this stuff linked together across the globe? The good thing is now we have tools where you can actually split your SSO domains if you want. If you're in this situation and it's actually not causing any problems, don't go completely break it down, right? If it's not causing a problem, you might be best served just to stick with what you got. But it's worth investigating and looking at because it is not, it's not trivial, but it's not too difficult of a process to split up an SSO domain or even combine SSO domains. Even if you're like, I have East and West Coast and they're separate SSO domains today, but it'd be really nice if I could put them in enhanced linked mode and manage them together. There's a tool, a command line tool to merge two SSO domains together. So it's all possible today. Another thing that I quickly wanted to mention was content library. We introduced content library in vSphere 6, but we've continued adding features along the way. I think with vSphere 7, content library is now in a position to be used by a vast majority of customers. You know, there were some limitations in the past that kind of had some challenges, you know, working with templates, you know, having to actually, you know, deploy a VM from a template out of the content library and then having to do a bunch of stuff to it and then re-importing it in order to get the configuration that you wanted, or having to just copy the template out and then deploy, you know, just weird things like that. A lot of that stuff has been corrected in vSphere 7, and we've also added a bunch of advanced configuration options so that you can do more with controlling the replication. If you're a manufacturing customer, for example, you might have manufacturing facilities that are still out in the boonies that, you know, maybe they've got T1 lines or, you know, even frac T1 lines. You know, Lord help you if you've got ISDN or something like that. But, you know, it may be tough to get a template or a VM to replicate across those lines without killing critical manufacturing applications, right? Because those links just don't have the bandwidth. So now we've introduced some advanced configurations to help control when that stuff can be replicated, how much bandwidth it can use, and those types of things. So that should hopefully enable some of the customers that were not able to use content library to now adopt content library. And I wouldn't tag this as like a major feature, but a lot, this is probably the most requested thing that I've heard over the years. Why can't I add more than one NIC to my vCenter server appliance? So with vCenter 7, now we support multi-homing. And really the primary reason to do this is a lot of customers have dedicated backup networks. and they want vCenter to be, to be able to use that dedicated backup network, right? This is not a way to get around security zones. If you've got a vCenter sitting in a DMZ or an air gap network somewhere, we didn't provide multi-homing support so that you can straddle security zones and then, expose your company to some big amount of attack, some big attack vector. So with great power comes great responsibility. So remember that. Use it for things that are appropriate, like backup network access, or if you've just got different management networks, you need vCenter to have access to those types of things. All right, I think with that, I've kind of talked through my hour. I will now, I'll hand it off to you, Bob. I didn't see any questions in the chat, so definitely feel free to chime in, and Bob will take us home.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Adam. So I'm Bob Plankers. I'm on the same team as Adam, and I specialize in security, vSphere security, the idea of intrinsic security. We talk a lot about intrinsic security. What does intrinsic mean? Well, the idea that we like to say it's baked in, not sprinkled on, that sort of thing. And it comes from, a lot of times when we see intrinsic security, we're talking about Carbon Black, app defense, NSX, things like that. And those things are very important. Those things are very interesting tools, but we bake it all the way down into vSphere as well. So usually when I like talking about security, I like starting with the tenets, the 3 tenets of information security, the CIA triad: confidentiality, the idea that we're keeping our data to ourselves; the integrity, that our data, if I leave a piece of data, if I leave a system somewhere, I want to return and have it still be there in the state that I left it, not corrupted, not messed with by somebody else, that sort of thing. And I want to be able to prove that as well. Availability is huge for security, but unfortunately, we usually leave it out. We're usually worried about confidentiality when we talk about security, but availability is a big part of it as well. System server's fault, the hardware failures, things like that the system is resilient enough to heal itself, to continue running, to limp through till a maintenance window, that sort of thing. Availability is also what gives us the ability to patch. And patching, as Adam has been talking about here, patching is very important. Upgrades are very important. Being able to, I mentioned at the beginning of this meeting, while we were waiting for people to join, that there's a big security vulnerability out there right now from last Thursday that's, pardon me, that's implicated in, or part of the upgrade process from 6.5 to 6.7 leaves a door open. Being able to patch, people who are not able to patch, they don't have that availability there. That's a real problem. And so I start with this because we can sort a lot of these features. We can sort most of the features in vSphere into these 3 categories. And this slide alone is super helpful for risk auditors, compliance auditors, things like that, because it becomes a communication problem. Explaining to an auditor what you're doing and how what you're doing already meets a compliance standard. I can talk at length about this. This is about vSphere 7, so I'm going to continue on. But the idea that our features mesh up with the CIA triad is a very powerful one. A lot of what Adam was talking about too comes through in the security area as well. We're really trying to make it easy to do the right thing when it comes to security. If we make it easy to do the right thing, all of our customers are humans, I'm a human, and staff time is one of the biggest things in an IT budget. It's often the biggest thing. If we can make it easy to do the right thing, we can make it easy to implement these security features, be more secure without the overhead. Because frankly, all this security stuff, it's all overhead. It's like an insurance policy. If it works, half the time you don't even know that it stopped something because it just hasn't happened. No news is good news. And yeah, so A good example of this, an example I always use, this is actually from vSphere 6.7, virtualization-based security. It's a very complicated thing under the hood, which you can see based on the yellow box there. There's a lot of stuff that needs to be enabled, but we've made it a checkbox. And so our goal moving forward, and especially with vSphere 7, is to keep doing this sort of thing, keep making it so that things are easy to turn on, that when you're building new templates, you can just check the box. Yes, I'd like VBS. Enabled a Microsoft Device Guard, Credential Guard. That's what this enables. And those, and Device Guard, Credential Guard, those are big parts of security and compliance standards moving forward. The DISA STIG, the Defense Information Systems Agency, releases STIGs, Security Technical Implementation Guides. And Windows 10 and Windows Server 2019 require this. And so being able to support that, being the best hypervisor for that is a really important part of our lives here. The other big thing that we're trying to do with security is to make the right thing the default. And you'll see some of that. vSphere 7 has made some steps towards that. We'll continue doing that with update releases and other major versions, and trying to push the defaults into a secure mode, but giving people the opportunity to back down off of them. You know, I like to joke with compliance that no compliance framework ever survived contact with an application. You know, there's always going to be some application that needs to be logged in as a console, as administrator or whatever, you know, and just horrific. I'm pausing because I'm having flashbacks to my former career, that sort of thing. Making the right thing the default is good. Being flexible for our customers is also really important for us as well. With all of that said, so that's a lot of intro here. With all of that said, I'd like to talk about some of the things in vSphere 7 as it pertains to security. So one is improved certificate management. Certificate management is one of the most complicated and confusing topics that we will talk about with customers on a weekly or daily basis. It's become kind of a rite of passage, actually, for new people on the team, on Adam's team. I am currently the newest guy on the team, so I have got certificate management, and like I said, it's confusing because people conflate encryption with trust and security, and it's a bigger conversation. I could talk for hours about this, and I'm not going to, thankfully. But I do want to mention that in vSphere 7, there continue to be 4 different certificate management modes that we can operate in. These are the same as 6.7, but I just want to review them because they play into one. They're very important for designs and system decisions and implementation decisions and things. But they play into what I'm about to talk about with vSphere 7 as well. So one of the modes is subordinate CA. We can make the VMware certificate authority is part of vCenter Server. It's a trusted part of vCenter Server. It's embedded in vCenter Server. We trust it completely because it is part of vCenter. If we don't trust the VMCA, then we don't trust vCenter, and that's a real problem too, because vCenter's got the keys to our infrastructure kingdom, right? So subordinate CA uses a VMCA for automation. Automation is really important. There's a lot of certificates floating around, and it can be made to operate as a subordinate certificate authority to a corporate PKI infrastructure. So your corporate certificate authority can issue certificates that make the VMCA a subordinate CA, which is great. All of a sudden, the VMCA can impersonate your organization, can sign things as the organization, but that's also the rub, that the VMCA now holds key material that could impersonate the organization, and most enterprise PKI teams really don't like that. In fact, if they're okay with it, you should probably ask some questions there too. They probably need to think about it a little bit more. As such, we don't recommend this mode. Is it fully supported? Absolutely. Support it. You can still do it. It's part of being flexible. There's a lot of people that have very good reasons for doing it, and they've got it under control, and they have compensating controls around it. Perfect. The other main mode that we don't really recommend is the fully custom one. It doesn't use the VMCA. There's no automation on the back end. The VMCA basically just sits there idle, no big deal. It's part of vCenter. You can't shut it off. It's just there. But we're not using it for our automation purposes any longer. a human comes along and manages the certificates. And there can be hundreds of these certificates in a cluster. Each one, you generate a key, a CSR. You can't use wildcard certificates. So you generate a new key, a CSR, certificate for each one of them. You have to manage all of that stuff. And it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work for the vSphere admins. It's a lot of work for the enterprise PKI people too. They have to go in and approve all these things, manage all of them. And in the end, it doesn't really improve security. Some folks think it does. Perhaps you're in an organization that considers it an improvement in security, but there's a lot of manual stuff, and especially with the new limits on certificate lifespans, especially Apple has started pushing that certificates won't be valid, won't be honored more than a year. Other stuff, the previous standard was 800 days. We've gone from 3 or 5 years down to 2 years, that sort of thing. As that sort of thing shrinks, this gets a lot trickier because you need to be on top of it, and that's a risk. So I'll just put it out there. We don't recommend this. So what do we recommend? Well, we recommend using the VMCA in fully automated mode. Using the VMCA's got a root certificate on its own. It's not a default certificate that ships with every copy of the product. It's generated when you install. So that's one of the questions we always get. People are looking for default certificates, and it's not a default certificate. It's self-signed. All CA certificates are self-signed. Your enterprise PKI infrastructure has a self-signed certificate. So if somebody asks you to get rid of self-signed certificates, well, they really need to throw away the enterprise PKI infrastructure as well, right? Well, they're not going to do that, but you can use now use that as an argument. Hey, wait a second here, that sort of thing. vSphere admins, if you've got a smaller environment, vSphere admins, well, most vSphere admin teams are smaller than the entire organization. Usually it's not the entire organization. And so you can just download that for the root certificate and install it on the few PCs for the admins. Usually not a big deal. Fully automated mode, there's also this thing called the machine SSL certificate or the machine certificate. Why we called it the machine certificate, not quite sure, because it's the human-facing thing in the vSphere client. And in fully automated mode, the machine certificate is managed by the VMCA as well. Again, not a big deal if you've only got a few people that are using the vSphere client. No big deal. They can just import this. It's trustworthy. It's secure. It saves a ton of time, and it reduces human error too. That the biggest problem with the fully manual mode is human error. And when you can automate this stuff, when you can just let the machines do what they're good at, let them do what they're good at and move on with your life. There's better things you can be doing. The other mode, and probably our most recommended mode, is hybrid mode. It's basically the same as fully automated mode, except we replace the machine certificate, the one that is human-facing, for the vSphere client. We replace that with one that's signed by a third party. That makes the browsers turn green. It lists it as secure. It's automatically trusted if you get it signed by a third party that's already trusted by the workstations. And maybe that's the opportunity to have the enterprise PKI infrastructure co-sign or sign a certificate for you. But then the smaller vSphere admin team can just import the VMCA root for trust for ESXi consoles and VAMIs and things like that. It's really the best of both worlds. You get the automation, but you get the trust so that you don't have to import certificates all over the place. So in vSphere 7 or in vSphere 6, we had lots of certificates. And I forgot, I'm surprised by my slide. I forgot that I made it an animated graphic here. There's all these solution certificates. And one of the things that we've done in vSphere 6 is we've simplified on both ESXi and vCenter server itself. We've really simplified how many certificates are out there. So if you are doing the full manual mode, there's a lot less stuff to worry about, and solution certificates aren't there. Those are all handled, authentication with those are handled differently now. It's still very secure, but we tried to get that out of the loop because it's just complexity we didn't need on the back end, complexity you didn't need on the front end. So a default install, there's basically a couple of certificates. You can import it straight from the interface here. In fact, there's a wizard that you can just replace the machine certificate very easily. It's very slick. It restarts vCenter server for you and takes care of it. Takes a few minutes. And yeah, away you go. The problem after that then is just getting your browser's cache figured out. You'll need to restart your browser and things like that. But that's no big deal. Adam mentioned APIs. APIs are huge in vCenter Server 7. Where we didn't have great API coverage in previous versions, there's something like 98% API coverage now for all of what's in vSphere. And that's huge. It's all REST-based. We've got a product manager that is intensely focused on this. And along with those come the certificate APIs. There's code examples out there. If you haven't checked out code capture, by the way, that's in the HTML5 client, it's a really powerful thing. It'll generate PowerCLI and now Go and Java and Python sample code. Basically you turn it on and it watches what you do in the client itself and then makes a script for you. Super powerful. You can see the APIs being used, that sort of thing. You can also automate it. In this case, as an example with Eckerle. And what are we doing here? We're renewing the host is the environment's in fully automated mode. We are replacing asking the VMCA to reissue the machine certificate. The VMCA you can replace, even if you're running in fully automated mode, you can regenerate the root certificate with your own information in it, and then you would do something like this to make sure that that new certificate gets pushed out. So lots of work for the certificates. Adam mentioned Identity Federation. Identity Federation is going to be huge. I've had to watch what I say because clearly the Kubernetes stuff is huge as well, but this is going to be very, very, very popular among all of our customers. Because why? Well, because MFA, multi-factor authentication, two-factor authentication, the idea that you're using a second factor, a one-time password, something retina scans, whatever, the idea that it's something something you are, that can be used to authenticate. Big part of compliance standards moving forward. And to be able to retrofit vCenter Server for all of the different ways to do two-factor authentication now was going to be impossible. So we kind of backed off the whole thing. And we now can use, OIDC, OAuth 2 to federate, initially here with ADFS, Active Directory Federation Services, but in the future, we've got on our roadmap additional services, things like that. And we basically offload the authentication and authorization to the enterprise systems that do that sort of thing. This is great. Reduced audit scope for vCenter Server. vSphere admins don't have to worry about onboarding and offboarding people anymore. They just worry about that with the they let the enterprise people deal with that. Why have two processes when you can just have one? That sort of thing. And turns out all these MFA solutions plug directly into these federated identity sources as well. So now we pick that up automatically and can move forward. So basically somebody will try to log in here. In fact, I've got, my next slide, basically to set it up, there's a change identity provider, and you do have to choose between things like Active Directory and AD over LDAP, integrated Windows authentication. Hey, speaking of which, IWA, if you read the release notes, and I definitely encourage reading release notes, you will see some very confusing language in there, and we're trying to get that cleaned up. IWA is not gone. We have announced that it will be deprecated in the future. So deprecation means that it's still there and supported, but may disappear in a future release. What we basically announced was we're intending to deprecate it. So we've probably got at least 2 major versions before IWA is gone. So don't worry about it. But if you read the release notes, don't freak out. My PSA of the day here. Anyhow, so you change identity provider. It gives you the URLs to plug into ADFS. You can go ahead. We've got this well documented in docs.vmware.com, all the vSphere 7 documentation. You plug those 2 redirect URIs in, and then you type in your email address. In this case, we've apparently got Stark Industries here. It kicks us out to our corporate identity provider. If we're already logged in, it'll kick us right back into vCenter, the vSphere client rather. If we're not logged in, it will do that process and then send us back in. This is going to be very popular. In fact, the day after vSphere 7 went GA, we had one of the vExperts. I didn't get his permission to publish it, so I clipped out his name here. But he was very excited he's a German fellow, and very excited for ADFS support. He got it configured, got it running, and I like seeing this sort of stuff. I think it's going to be very powerful. vSphere Trust Authority. So this is another new feature for vSphere 7 in the security realms. VTA, basically in vSphere 6.7, we added the idea of attestation. Attestation is where the vCenter server works with the Trusted Platform Module, TPM, on a host, and the secure boot process to watch and use cryptographic methods to watch and confirm that everything that started at boot time is what we expect. It's authentic. It's configured the way, if we care about parts of the configuration, that configuration is set up correctly, that sort of thing. So vSphere 7, or vSphere 6.7 rather, added attestation and TPM 2.0 support for this. That's great. But there are no repercussions for failing. If a secure workload, if a host boots, a secure workload can still move over there. Additionally, vCenter server could be one of those secure workloads. It could be one of the workloads running inside that cluster, and it could end up on a host that is untrustworthy. And we don't like that. You know, it's better than what we had in 6.5, but we can do even better. And so, you know, there's some other things. Encryption keys are managed by vCenter server. We can't encrypt vCenter server. There's chicken and egg problems, that sort of thing. And then vCenter server basically has the keys to the whole kingdom. We can't do principle of least privilege, which is another key InfoSec concept. You know, the idea that only the people should only have access, should only have rights to do what they need to do is their job. So in vSphere 7, we invented the vSphere Trust Authority. This creates a separate hardware root of trust. And so those are 3 separate hosts. You can use a management cluster if you're following something like the VMware validated design, where you've got a separate management cluster from your workload clusters, that sort of thing. You can use the management cluster. Ideally, you would have 3 additional hosts. They can be very small. We'd like them to be supported. They're ESXi hosts. These processes just run on ESXi. Create a separate cluster and to do remote attestation for all of the workload clusters. And these can be thousands of other clusters you can use those 3 trusted hosts for. But you can make, now when you separate it like this, you can make attestation a requirement for access to the encryption keys. So a secure workload that is encrypted and protected cannot run on a host that fails attestation, because that host does not have access to the encryption keys anymore. And so it's just not possible. It won't even try to vMotion over there because it knows the host is not functioning correctly. Those are consequences. As I would tell my kids, these are consequences for their actions, you know. And so, you know, and that's good. That's, in this case, that's very good. The keys flow through the trusted hosts. It also means we can encrypt vCenter server. We can separate vCenter server. There's going to be a separate vCenter server to manage the trusted hosts too. And so we can take a very core of admins and have them, a small team, a very trusted team, manage the trusted hosts. And we can give wider access to the vCenter servers out that are managing the workload hosts as well. All of this, it's very important to have TPM 2.0 trusted platform modules installed in hosts. Basically, any server that's been that's shipped in the last 10 years can have a TPM module in it. TPM in it. TPM module is redundant, but if you're ordering new hardware, please, they're $20, something like that. Your mileage may vary; they might be 30. But they're not very expensive compared to retrofitting them later. And TPM is playing a huge part in infrastructure security moving forward. I definitely recommend adding them. Even if you don't do VTA, even if you don't enable this stuff right now, get the TPMs installed on the physical hosts so that you can do at least the vCenter attestation. That stuff is all still there. Another feature, SGX. Intel has got the software guard extensions in some of their CPUs. And this allows applications to ask the hardware to create what we call a secure enclave that cannot be viewed by the guest operating system, and it cannot be viewed by the hypervisor, ESXi. And that reduces risks. Not that we think that ESXi is insecure. It's not. It's very secure. The guest OS is very secure as well. Keep it patched, please, but keep both of them patched. But from a risk perspective, the fewer things that have access to something, the better, right? I think it was Ben Franklin that actually said that 3 can keep a secret if 2 are dead, that sort of thing. And this is sort of the computing version of that. And so the application, it's got to be, and it's not just any application. They have to be compiled and built for SGX, can request this from the hardware. And then it can move sensitive data into that enclave and keep it away from the hypervisor, keep it away from the operating system. And what Intel has done is actually they've made it so that the OS and the hypervisor can see a little bit of it, enough to be able to manage it, manage the memory and things like that, but they can't see into it. It's a complete black box. This is Intel only. AMD has got their SEV and SEVES technologies, which is a completely different approach, of course. There are no standards in this area. So this is Intel. We're looking at, we announced the AMD, the intention to support AMD technologies. We were on stage at the AMD Rome launch last fall, and we are continuing with that as well. And so we had announced our intention to support those. That's not in 7 currently. To enable this, you need a system that supports this. Intel CPUs, there's only a few of them that support it that are server class, and they're all single socket right now. Intel, in their public roadmaps, have said that Ice Lake will have dual socket SGX. It's really 2 one-socket SGX CPUs, but that'll be the first time that that we really see enterprise hypervisor class, server class support for these sorts of things. So you need to turn it on, you need to set it to unlocked, have UEFI boot enabled. If that's another thing, as you're thinking about 7, as you're thinking about upgrading, if you're not using UEFI boot, if you don't have secure boot enabled, please consider turning that on. That's another big part of that, especially if you've got TPMs. TPM can't work without that. There's no such thing as a free lunch. This is not, if you've got an application that supports SGX, that's not a clear improvement to your security posture, or your risk posture. One of the things about cutting out the hypervisor, not allowing the hypervisor to see data in your VM, is that the hypervisor can't move it then. vMotion out the window. All of a sudden, we can't do fault tolerance. We can't suspend VMs. We can't take snapshots of VM memory. We can still take snapshots on disk, but we can't take snapshots of VM memory because it's protected. We can't see into it. Guest integrity from App Defense doesn't work with this. But the big one is vMotion. All of a sudden, you've pinned a VM to a particular host. And so if you're going to be able to patch your infrastructure, if you're going to continue to have availability in your infrastructure, you need to make sure that the applications, you've worked out with the applications, that you can take those down during maintenance windows, that there is a clear maintenance window that you can use to patch your infrastructure. So that's my public service announcement. This whole thing, given that it really obstructs availability and patching, it may not reduce your audit scope. It may not reduce your risk. So definitely think about it before you implement it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about hardware and resource management as well. I like to think that security guys, because of the CIA triad, have their fingers in everything. Well, these are some availability things. First, I'll talk about timekeeping. vSphere 7 introduces hardware version 17, VM hardware version 17, and along with that comes this idea of a precision clock. We've got a lot of applications, a lot of customers that would like to use PTP, Precision Time Protocol, for sub-millisecond accuracy in their VMs, and we can do that now. We've basically plumbed in a new device into the VM. Rather than having the VM listen on the normal V switches and DV switches, we've plumbed in a new device that is low latency so that we can manage that. And it works with ESXi. ESXi needs to be set to either NTP or PTP. Right now, you can't have both. But if you've got PTP masters on your network, then ESXi can take advantage of those and have really accurate time in your guests. Additionally, in the vSphere, the VM hardware version 17, we've got a virtual watchdog timer. This has been asked for a long time. It's great to see that it's been added. A lot of applications can use a watchdog timer to try to figure out if a cluster host, a guest VM that's part of a clustered application, if that stopped responding for some reason. The watchdog timer expires. Basically, a watchdog timer is something that the OS keeps resetting, and if it doesn't reset it, then the hardware knows that something has gone wrong, and then you can take action. We can have an HA event, we can restart it, that sort of thing. And so this is going to be very important for self-healing, self-recovering. It also sets flags so that the application, when it boots again, knows that something bad happened, and it can do some recovery actions there, that sort of thing. So I hope you're all sitting down. You probably are, given the format of this. I hope you're all sitting down, but VMware hardware version 17 actually lists Windows Server 2019 as a separate operating system. You don't have to use 2016 anymore. If you're using older versions of hardware for compatibility, you still pick 2016. No big deal. We encourage you to use hardware 17 anyhow. But, I might poke fun at this a little bit. We're very serious at VMware sometimes, but it's fun to poke fun a little bit. There are some pretty serious changes in the virtual hardware 17 defaults. One of which is USB 3.1 support. For server operating systems, probably not the biggest deal. You might even choose to remove that from your templates if you're building new templates, that sort of thing. And if you're building new templates, please turn on VBS and some of the other secure boot functions, that sort of thing. The next thing you'll notice, though, is an NVMe controller. Hey, where's the SCSI controller? Well, we started poking at this a little bit, and it turns out the LSI logic drivers that are in Windows that we use for older versions of the virtual hardware are actually really old, and Microsoft wants them gone. And we've basically asked Microsoft nicely, and they kind of rolled their eyes and said, fine, to leave them in Windows Update for us right now, leave them in their products. But, we need a better solution moving forward. And turns out our NVMe controller is something that Windows can see natively when you install the operating system. And so that's the solution moving forward. You're probably going to replace it with a paravirtualized SCSI driver anyhow. Same with the NICs. But this gets you started. This gets you on the road to being able to use the VM itself. The other thing I'd like to point out is that security devices, TPM, and the virtual TPM, which, by the way, has got nothing to do with a physical TPM. It's got everything to do with VM encryption. So if you want to use virtual TPMs, you need to have VM encryption enabled. And virtual SGX, the VSGX capabilities are in a new security devices category here, where you can turn them on or turn them off. So we still have the E1000E NIC, though. I know that will make some of you happy. Yes, it's still there. Don't worry about it. It'll still be there. There's some semblance that will be our touchstone, our bedrock here in virtual hardware 17. But again, probably a good idea to replace it with the VMX NIC 3 NIC, the paravirtual NIC itself. So speaking of virtual hardware 17, one of the other things that's come along, and Adam spoke to this a little bit, as well as the idea of assignable hardware. And you know what I was saying about VSGX, where it pins a VM to a particular host. Well, the same has been true in the past with GPUs and FPGAs and other accelerator hardware. All this AI and ML talk, all these applications that would like to use this, VDI even, that sort of stuff. All of a sudden, these VMs are pinned to a particular host, and that's a maintenance problem. It's an operational problem. So what do we do about it? Well, we invent assignable hardware where we take direct path IO and we make it dynamic. We set up some rules around, hey, we want this VM to connect to a GPU, but maybe not a specific GPU, just a GPU that meets these criteria, this particular criteria, an NVIDIA V100 or whatever it is. And that way DRS can place it. You turn a VM on, and it doesn't have to be on that particular host. That makes capacity planning a lot easier. HA can recover if a host faults for some reason. Then HA can look it through the cluster and say, hey DRS, what other hosts have hardware that meets the requirements here? And DRS can say, hey, host 3 over here can take it. And that's great. It's a real operational bonus there, especially as we really AI and ML capabilities are really taking off, and that's a real important thing for us. I've got some of Niels Hogurt's slides here. I'm not going to go through all of them. He can talk for hours about this stuff. He has literally written the book about this sort of stuff. But I'll hit the highlights here. So we talked about DirectPath IO. Basically, it virtualizes some of the hardware addressing for these devices, so that the guest operating system itself sees a virtual PCI device there, and then that allows ESXi and vCenter Server and DRS and all that to move things around, to map that. I mean, we are a virtualization company, right? And the old adage is that all problems in computer science can be solved with another layer of abstraction. Well, here it is for PCI. I think I covered most of this stuff. It's more about exposing the capabilities to the guest rather than the specific device itself. And again, hardware 17, you just configured a new PCI device. You pick a class of devices, you define a class of devices, and then you can choose from it. This is so DRS. Speaking of that, oops, let me skip back. Sorry, my mouse is falling off my desk here. So DRS, talked a bit about DRS as well. DRS is very improved. We really went back to the basics on a lot of these core technologies. vMotion is, I think it's from 2006. It was pretty much the first killer feature, and then DRS came shortly after that. The idea of, why don't we have the cluster manage itself, rather than humans trying to do placement of VMs, play Tetris with our workloads. Let's just let the cluster do it. A computer is better at playing Tetris anyhow, right? And so the original DRS, it was very cluster centric. It would look at the level of work being done in the cluster, the level of load on the cluster on a host by host basis. Host A or host 1 is too hot, so we'll move some of that workload over to host 2 and host 3, that sort of thing. It ran every 5 minutes, and it was mostly just cared about the ESXi hosts. Well, as it turns out, we don't really care about the ESXi hosts, because infrastructure is not an end unto itself, right? Infrastructure is there to support workloads. Well, that's the big improvement in vSphere 7. The DRS there is very workload centric. It's all about keeping the VM and the subsequent workload that's installed on the VM happy. It runs every minute. And it creates a score for the VM itself, and not for the cluster necessarily. You see that there's a cluster score that's an aggregate of the VM scores, but it's based on memory here. In fact, it's based on memory, it's based on cache behavior, it's based on CPU ready time, headroom. If the workload is bursty, we can notice that sort of thing, and how big of a deal is it to migrate? If we move a VM from one spot, from one host to another, is there a big cost in that? So smaller VMs are easier to move, and so that we can use that to account for how we can use that to create a plan for how we go about balancing the cluster out. And again, we're not really balancing the cluster. We're making sure that the VMs are happy. So if all of the VMs in your cluster are happy on one host, fine, nothing will happen. If they're not, though, it'll take action to make the VMs happy. It's not making the cluster happy. Nobody cares about the cluster anymore. That sounds mean, but sorry, hypervisors. We're here for the workloads. So one of the other things that comes along with this sort of attitude is the idea of scalable shares. If you've used resource pools, you've probably been bitten at some point in the past, or in the process of being bitten, by the idea that a resource pool, once it's configured, you can get into situations where you've got, especially if you use resource pools to sort of delineate production from non-production sorts of things, you end up getting non-production stuff accidentally through the resource pool mechanisms. You can get them so that the non-production stuff has way more priority, way more access to the resources than your production stuff, and that's not cool. So this has been a persistent problem here, and solving it also for the Kubernetes, the vSphere with Kubernetes functions as well. Because as you add stuff to namespaces, as containers instantiate, we need to be able to make the resource pools relational to each other. So the idea of scalable shares is really important. It's what we call them, DRS scalable shares. Basically, this is this is a view of when they're not enabled. You can see that virtual machine 1 and 2 and 3 all get basically the same access here, but the you enable scalable shares, and then it can make the it takes into account the relationships between the resource pools as well, and so that VMs that should have more priority get more priority, don't accidentally have less priority as part of operations. It's a checkbox, make it easy to do the right thing. It's checkboxes both in the resource pools and the clusters. And again, we need them for the Kubernetes functions. I mentioned vMotion. vMotion, we went back to the basics here as well. Adam mentioned vMotion. And the improving vMotion is huge, not just for big VMs, but also little VMs too. You know, the idea that stun time, the actual, so vMotions for big VMs, we've got a lot of people running big VMs, SAP HANA, databases, MS SQL, SQL Server, things like that. And that stun time, right at the end where it needed to make a final copy of memory and it stuns the VM in order to move it, that was a very variable thing. It had a very significant impact on guest performance. And app admins saw it. It showed up in monitoring systems. In my previous life as a virtual infrastructure lead, I had an app team that basically built an entire monitoring system to tell me when I vMotioned something because they were worried about the stun time. You know, and I mean, they were telling me things that I knew already. Thanks, folks. You know, but the vMotion is an important part of our availability story. It's an important part of our automation story. Anytime you have to shut vMotion off or curtail its operations, that's a serious penalty on the vSphere admins. You know, that's your will to live evaporating basically. And so we wanted to do something about that. And so what we did, one of the big problems was the stun time. How do we fix the stun time? One of the other problems was performance during the vMotion itself. So in vSphere 6.x, 6.0, 6.5, 6.7, vMotion installs basically little shims in between the virtual CPU on all of them, and starts doing its memory operations, keeps track of changed memory pages, keeps replicating this stuff. It's spread across the whole VM, so the whole VM gets slow pretty much equally, you know, and so that was one of the complaints. In vSphere 7, we took that out, and we only install the page tracers, the page and the things that monitor the page table entries. We only install them on one CPU. So all the other vCPUs can continue unhindered serving the workloads just as you would expect. A lot faster. Applications do not see a slowdown like they used to. Much more efficient this way. And yeah, again, the emphasis on workloads, just like with DRS. We're trying to keep the workloads running. We're trying to keep the app admins from bothering you vSphere admin types, you know, and you know, that's a very, very good thing. You know, this all should be magic from their perspective. The other thing that we're doing is, so that's, if you've got a monster VM that's got 24 terabytes of memory, I'd love to have a lab with 24 terabytes of memory. Heck, I'd love to have a production environment with 24 terabytes of memory. But a 24 terabyte VM, the full bitmap at the end of, in vSphere 6.7, the full bitmap to move that from one host to another was 768 megabytes. And on fast network links, 40 gig links in that takes like 2 seconds to move, you know, and you might not think 2 seconds is that big of a deal, but to an application that's doing a lot of stuff, to a VM that's that big and it's got a lot of stuff going on it, that's huge. That's a 2 second stoppage basically means that a lot of people are anxious about vMotions. Well, hey, wait a second. Why don't we take a look at that? And why don't we compact that bitmap? Why don't we take a few extra passes at it? So we do things a little differently. We've cut that down to 175 milliseconds for the worst case example, 24 terabytes of VRAM. And that's huge. That also means that small VMs are even faster than that. And that's really important. And so huge improvements to vMotion, hopefully with a little bit of testing and a little bit of positive, you know, sysadmins are very, no news is good news, but a little bit of outreach by vSphere admins. Hey, we're going to upgrade to vSphere 7 and we're going to upgrade to vSphere 7. We're going to get a new version of vMotion. We can actually do a little bit of testing to see if, you know, these big VMs, the app teams that might be worried about this, maybe they need you to schedule vMotions, things like that. You know, we can work on them now. We can get them to relax a little bit, you know, and prove it out. In our testing, in our labs, this works great, but it's, and it'll be fun to see vSphere admins out in the wild be able to take advantage of it as well. So the last thing I'll say too, as far as hardware acceleration goes, is BitFusion. BitFusion is coming down the line here. If you're not familiar with it, it's basically, you know, I joked earlier about solve all problems with another layer of abstraction. Well, BitFusion abstracts GPUs, FPGAs, the ASICs, all those sorts of hardware accelerators, especially for machine learning, AI workloads, that sort of thing, abstracts them away, virtualizes them, such that a VM that is taking advantage of a BitFusion virtualized hardware accelerator can exist anywhere in your cluster, anywhere in your infrastructure. And that's powerful. Not only are you not tied to a particular GPU anymore, but that GPU doesn't even have to be in the particular server. And so DRS can place it based on other factors, you know, and not worry about the GPU availability, that sort of thing. This is going to be really powerful. It's part of vSphere. It's going to be part of vSphere. And if you're interested in this, if you've got ML, AI workloads, I definitely encourage you to take a look at this, because it's going to be, like I said, a very powerful sort of thing. I see the chat. Oh, there's a lot of stuff in chat here. Let me fire that up somewhere here on my PC. I don't know where chat is. Oh, there we go. So can you have access to the slide deck? I'll let Adam do that. The answer is probably VSGX support for their SEV on Epic. SEV and VSGX are two different approaches to the same problem. And it's a roadmap item. We announced it as part of our roadmap. We don't really do time frames and stuff like that, because we don't want to promise something and not deliver it. Keep your eye on the space. We're very interested in it. AMD is very interested in it. And so, especially with CPU vulnerabilities in that, AMD has got a real shot at stuff here, and people are very interested in what they've got. And so we've taken that to heart. We're working on it. Let's see, not a chatty bunch. Hey, whatever. And yeah, that's it. Adam, did you have anything that you wanted to add? I think we've got a slide on end of general support for 6.0. Basically, if you're running 6.0, you should probably consider moving off of it. Please consider moving to 7.0. You know, 6.7, as Adam was saying, basically your service and support contracts, SNS contracts entitle you to this stuff. And every release has got new stuff that makes your life better. Don't forego that. You know, plan these upgrades, get them done, take advantage of the new features. There's upgrade service. So basically, you can, if you're running 6.0, you can pay for support and guidance until 2022. That buys you a little bit of time, but you need to be thinking about it. Adam, did you want to talk about the new vSphere here?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what else hasn't been said, but the biggest takeaway I think is the link at the bottom there. That's a short link to a page on the vSphere blog where we've been basically just putting links to all the different resources. So, you know, if you missed it and you're interested in looking at it now, or you just want to look at it again, this page that's linked here has a list of all the different resources, whether it's the launch event or just all the different blog posts where Bob and team have gone into greater detail on the topics that we've discussed today, and even more. And there's more coming, right? I think I tallied it up the other day. I think, you know, we have over 30 blog posts planned, and most of them are now out on the vSphere blog that cover these topics in technical detail. So, yeah, that link is the one I would walk away with.
Yeah, and if you don't subscribe to our blog, blogs.vmware.com/vSphere, like Adam said, there's a ton of content. We've got stuff basically planned out, until the middle of May or something like that, Adam?
Yeah, I think it's June, actually.
June now? Wow. Has gotten away from me. And so it's really important. Point your RSS reader at it, feed readers, that sort of thing, and it'll show up automatically. So I think that pretty much brings us to the end. Thanks for listening. If you've got questions, we can ask them in the chat channel here, or hit us up on Twitter, or email us. I'm rplankers@vmware.com. You can always email me, and I can figure it out if I can't answer it, I'll find somebody who can. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks everyone very much.